Hi, welcome to Philosopher Meets Critics. My name is Paul Silva. I'm a junior professor here at the University of Cologne. Philosopher Meets Critics is run by the University of Cologne and the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. I'm quite pleased to introduce you all today to Stephen Hetherington and his book. His book is titled Defining Knowledge, and it has been published with Cambridge University Press. Stephen's an emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales. He took his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, and he's a prolific author. He has nearly 150 publications to date, articles and books, all in epistemology, or at least primarily in epistemology. And he's also the former decade-long editor of the distinguished Australasian Journal of Philosophy. And many of us have had the pleasure of working with him in that capacity in the past. And we're quite happy to have him with us today. Now, Stephen's got three critics, each a distinguished epistemologist in their own right: Anthony Booth, Pierre Morvan, and Baron Reed. They will tackle Stephen's book in that order. Anthony's a professor of ethics and epistemology at the University of Sussex. He took his PhD from Durham and has published numerous articles in epistemology, the philosophy of mind, ethics, political philosophy, applied philosophy, and Islamic philosophy. Pierre is a professor of philosophy at the College of New Jersey. He took his PhD from Syracuse, and his publications are again in epistemology and philosophy of mind, covering topics such as the nature of knowledge and its relation to ignorance, virtue and vice epistemology, the nature of learning, skepticism, the nature of privacy and its epistemic conditions, and sensory experience and intentionality. Baron Reed, our final critic, is a professor at Northwestern University. He took his PhD from Brown. His primary area of research is in epistemology, with publications covering topics such as skepticism, foundationalism, certainty, pragmatic encroachment, fallibilism, epistemic agency, and intellectual virtues. So those are our critics. Stephen is again our author, and we're quite pleased to let Stephen take it away and tell us a bit of what his book is about, and then we'll let the critics lean in, and we'll go from there. So please, Stephen, take us away.
Thanks very much, Paul, for this opportunity to discuss my little book, Defining Knowledge, or booklet, as I like to think of it. It is about the nature of knowledge, but it's not definitive in that way. It's really exploring possibilities about what knowledge might be. But even then, the preliminary question, which is really the key focus, is a kind of concern about what I take to be a fact, but also the reason for that fact of epistemologists having failed to understand what knowledge might be. Look, we still think about it. Are we following the right paths? I have a worry about that. And I think it's a surprising worry, I think, because in my view, it's a simple methodological failure that has been in part of contemporary epistemology, certainly for it's become pretty embedded, I think. And the reason it's simple and I think surprising is not so much that it's, if I'm right, that it's prominent, but that it reflects a failure to engage properly with a methodological constraint that has been with us from Plato. And when you go looking for it, Aristotle. So there's, as I see it, and I'll explain it just now very quickly in a moment, it's an investigative constraint that I think that we should feel as being placed upon us, that we should place upon ourselves as we try to think about the nature of knowledge. So here's a simple kind of theme of defining knowledge, which is that there was a standard or constraint that was clearly in place, clearly being given to us in a very prominent bit of ancient Greek epistemology, and contemporary epistemology has just simply been failing it. And so in that sense, we should be going back to something that we probably, most of us think we already have well under control. a key little element of some ancient Greek epistemology. So that's what I highlight in defining knowledge, and I try to spell out what I take to be some critical implications of that. So the constraint appears near the end of Plato's Meno. And here's the irony, actually, it's in precisely those pages near the end that we often set for our students, even for a very first piece of epistemology. I'm not exaggerating. I think it's not uncommon to say, all right, let's, in an intro class here, let's epistemology, theory of knowledge. Theorizing. Where did that begin for us? Well, let's have a look at these pages from this dialogue called Meno. All right, so what do we find there? Let me give a very, very quick bit of stage setting. So in those closing pages of the Meno, we find Socrates and Meno. They agree that knowledge is not simply true doxa, or what we tend to say true belief. Okay, so they argue there's a distinctness there. But then they also agree, and this is where what we often like to take our students through, we find them agreeing that knowledge is somehow more than true belief. And by that, it doesn't mean like just a higher amount of stuff. They mean it's true belief plus, namely that we add something to a true belief if we're going to have knowledge. So what's that something? In the Meno, it's really just a very short passage, as we know, but it's really engaging. It's really nice. It's good. So what you get there, the suggestion in the Meno there from Socrates is that something, that added something, is what's called the tethering. So Socrates, this is a metaphor, and he expands on that metaphor. He compares a true belief, true doxa, with one of those special statues from Daedalus. And they were special because they had the power to move, and not just, from us, but on their own account. So why would he mention it? Because he likes the idea, or he thinks we should take seriously the idea that, say, a true belief, if it wasn't tethered, it wasn't somehow being held in place, it could run away. It could leave us, wander off. So in that sense, the idea is that the statue is there and it's got this kind of intrinsic value. But because it's also got this kind of tendency of potentially to wander away, if we don't hold it, we lose that value. And if we don't, in effect, add some value to the situation, we add the value to that statue. It's value for us anyway. It doesn't make it more of a beautiful statue or anything, but we get this added kind of value by being able to hold the thing in place and therefore being able to use it, for example. That's definitely a theme that runs through those pages. It's about how we use the true belief. That's really key. Anyway, so that's metaphorical and it's fun. Okay, so since then, what do we get? Well, certainly in contemporary epistemology, when we're directed to that evocative few pages, epistemologists have tried to understand that tethering idea less metaphorically. And so you get the idea that tethering is something like adding some kind of epistemic justification, or that's a more generic idea. Then at times people have talked about warrant. Tracking for the last 40 plus years has been a very prominent generic idea, able to be then, because then epistemologists get to work and give us tons and tons and tons more details. That's what journals are for a start. Lots of details. So, we talk about, so you're going to make choices of what kind of tethering is going on, details, even what kind of tethering. Okay. And then we get, that's professional epistemology, or a big chunk of it. Okay. But this is also where, as I argue in defining knowledge, epistemologists have routinely lost touch with the original Platonic challenge that was being put in front of them. the Meno. So what I say is that they need to be addressing what I call the further features question, but that they failed to do so. The question is very simple, and I hope it's clear that in the little sketch I gave, it was there. It was being exemplified. So the question is, what further features have to be added to a true belief if it's to be knowledge? What further features are needed? Not just sort of in the vicinity, but needed, what they have to be added to the true belief, to somehow enrich it, to add something, to add some value to that thing. Now, epistemologists will routinely say that they engage with that question when they're offering those theories of justification or warrant or tracking. And I say, and argue in some detail in this little booklet, that they don't. They do add conditions. We're all used to that. So you might kind of schematically, it'd be like, knowledge equals truth, belief plus X plus Y. So I say that they'll add the conditions, but here's the key move, which I'll explain with an example in a moment, but they don't add conditions that are themselves describing adding to the true belief. So like they add conditions, maybe to true belief conditions, and then they'll infer that therefore they've come up with knowledge is XY true belief. But as I explain, in effect, saying something like knowledge is true belief plus X plus Y does not entail knowledge is XY true belief. That inference is taken for granted in epistemological practice, but as I go through with examples in the booklet, it doesn't work. So I'll give you one prominent example. It's from, again, Robert Nozick, 1981. He gave us, well, quite a lot. But one of his more discussed conditions there is this epistemic sensitivity condition. Now, the idea is very, very simple. And it's very tempting for many of us if we think, what does knowing involve? And we'll say something like, suppose you're asking, does so-and-so know that P? And then the sensitivity condition, as I'm sure most or all of you are aware, is very simple. You say something like, well, consider, if P hadn't been true, would S or that same person have still continued to believe P? Believe that P. And then we're taken through in sort of the professional approach of the time then and since, we'll be taken through stuff about possible worlds. Now, so here is that you re-identify that look across possible worlds, and you say, anyway, sorry, I just got my computer stuff just got a bit complicated for a moment. That's life. Back with you. So the question was, you're asking about whether someone knows a P. All right, fine. Consider possible worlds where P isn't true. Do they continue to believe that P? If they don't, if they do continue to believe that P, even when P isn't true, then obviously there's a kind of sort of, let's say, roughness about their believing it here and getting it right. So we'll say sort of it's a clumsiness. Then one way to put it is, roughly speaking, there's a kind of generic luck there about it. But in any case, it's a lack of sensitivity and not appropriately closely tied enough to that fact. All right, so I am being quick and rough about that, but the general idea is very easy to criticize. I claim that is just simply beside the point. You don't have to think about details for it. You don't have to fuss around and consider all the relevant possible worlds within that once you've started like that, because you're already on the wrong track. Why? Because so you're being asked to consider a whole lot of possible worlds from the start where it's not true that P. Therefore, already from the outset, just in terms of how this is being set up, you are not going to be monitoring or re-identifying across those worlds that particular true belief, which we were asking about in the first place. This is a simple point about trying to work out the essential properties of something. You re-identify it across worlds and ask and look and see what other properties come with it. Well, here's the idea. Re-identify, in terms of applying the Platonic further features question, re-identify that true belief and see what's also there with it in the relevant worlds. Once you've set it up with not P worlds, you are not re-identifying the true belief that P. You're just examining something else. You're not answering the original question of what must be added to that true belief if it's going to be knowledge. You can be asking about the sensitivity of the belief, for example, but it's not the true belief itself. You are not finding an essential property that goes along with it. So, and then, okay, lots of details. That's the basic idea, basic worry already. And I go through in defining knowledge, I go through some other kinds of relevant cases and to build the larger case argument here. It also fits well, by the way, that kind of limitative result. It fits well with what I also explain in the book. I go with some of Aristotle's writing, in, especially in the posterior analytics, about explanatory understanding. So there, the idea is that because what's implicit also in what I'm saying is that you need you need the idea of a proper ordering in building up the account, so that you understand a nature. So, for example, in the Aristotelian approach there, that you would look first to find a genus, in this case, say, true belief, and then you'd look for differentiate within that. So, true belief plus further features to connect with the earlier point. And that restricts the form of a resulting explanation. So it's not, the idea is, it's not enough just to put a bunch of, find some favored conditions and list them. You actually, in a sense, there's a kind of constructing process, and the ordering matters. The ordering reflects a kind of way of building the explanation, the picture. And that is, again, fits with the original question from the Meno, as I read it, that you have to think what is added to the true belief, in effect, within the genus of true belief. So that's kind of the picture there. And I realize that in the abstract it can sound, okay, well, how does that play out? Well, it means it basically, as I explained in the book, it will mean that, as I said, there are a lot of accounts, contemporary accounts, which are in effect beside at least the point that was being set in place in the Meno. Now, I'm not saying the Meno must be right in every way, but the point is we care about the Meno. We ask students to care about it. We look back at it, it's a really lovely, Plato was amazing. And this is a beautiful little bit of incredibly succinct, suggestive, clear philosophy. What better sort of place to start thinking about things? So we do. And my point is, my argument is that we then we've proceeded to go off, we've proceeded to follow, some very misleading paths as a result. All right, so that's a big chunk of defining knowledge, and that's all critical. I do close. So where does that lead us? Am I just being critical? No. When I started talking here, I said, look, it's also about what knowledge might be. I don't give a definitive alternative account, but I do say, look, think of it, if insofar as we're going to struggle potentially coming up with further essential features for knowing beyond true belief, it's at least worth revisiting what I call knowledge minimalism, which is the idea that in some form or other, knowledge is just true belief. Now, I say in some form or other because there are different possible forms. Here's the one I gesture at, and I liken them. No, that's the only form that this thinking path could lead us to, but here's one thought that I do float in the book. that what we're being asked to consider is the difference between, say, knowledge as essence and various accidental features that a given instance of knowing could have. Right. So the idea would be that the essence always of knowing is something like a true belief, a true doxa. That's always present. But then on given different occasions, different instances of knowledge, or if we're worried about the word there, well, different instances of knowledge could be combined of the essence plus different accidents. So different kinds of justification in different situations, different strengths of justification, each of which and the idea is, of course, that, we do care about context, especially in, the last 20, 30 years, whatever. Many of us have been particularly attracted to thinking about epistemic context. Well, this links up with that too, because we've looked at those contexts and noted variability across them of epistemic features. And then we worry, well, is knowing here? Are we putting lower standards for knowing in this one or that one? Yeah, fair enough. All reasonable questions. But it can connect here with the idea, because you can still say, well, how does it get to be knowing at all across the various contexts? What varies, what doesn't? So at least this is one kind of schema. If you have an essence, and you can argue that something like true belief, it's always present if knowing is going to be present, but then different standards come and go for various reasons. Those are the accidents, the accidental features, to use the classic metaphysical kind of picture here. I do think more epistemologists should be doing more metaphysics as well. It's more old-fashioned these days, but that's neither good nor bad in itself. But the point is that I do think that epistemology is enriched by it. So I hope that part of the spirit behind this little booklet is that kind of idea that I do like blending the two. So, well, look, I almost forgot. The actual booklet ends. That's not quite where it ends. It ends with, well, I like to say it's an amazing discovery. You wander in the bookshops in Sydney and secondhand bookshops, and what do you find? Well, tucked around, you can find ancient bits of manuscript, which you just wouldn't have expected. Bits of so what am I alluding to? Well, you have to read it, but I can gesture at. I'll give you a hint. I do end the booklet with an imagined continuing of the Theaetetus, just for a few pages. But as the Theaetetus ends with a bit of overlap with the Meno, but also extension. The overlap is that Socrates walks away still convinced that knowledge is distinct from true belief. What he's given in the end of the Theaetetus, the last 10 or so Stephanus pages, is, he goes through three. He's just saying schematically, in effect, that the difference is going to be some kind of logos. But he goes through three proposals as to what the logos, how we might want to understand that idea of logos in order to understand the difference between true belief or true doxa and knowledge. Okay, none of them work, he argues. He walks away, but he's still convinced, it seems, that knowledge is more than true belief. Well, in these pages, that apparently, who am I to say? But they apparently continue the Theaetetus, and look, I just read what I see there. But what I see there is that you've got Socrates adapting that last bit of reasoning. The last bit of reasoning was where he considered the idea of a logos as a distinguishing mark, say, between the known X and any, say, non-X Y. So distinguishing between what's the object of the knowledge and anything else. So that's a distinguishing mark. He argues it doesn't, even that won't work as a way of understanding logos there to differentiate between knowledge and true doxa. Well, I almost said in those final pages, those imagined further pages or whatever from the Theaetetus, it seems that Socrates considered adapting that last bit of reasoning to suddenly think, to wonder whether the idea of a logos at all could function as a distinguishing mark between true doxa and knowledge. In this case, higher order true doxa and higher order knowledge about knowledge. But, you know, if it doesn't work at the lower level, and given that the lower level was meant to be about everything, all objects of knowledge, then it won't work at the higher level. I look, as I say, it seems, going from those pages, we've been given some evidence that, you know, Socrates could have walked away from the Theaetetus. He didn't, but he could have walked away as a knowledge minimalist, accepting that, look, maybe at the end of the day, in other words, could have been even more aporia there. At the end of the day, maybe we even give up on the idea that knowledge is distinct from true belief. Well, look, again, who am I to say one way or the other? But that's what it looks like at the end there. So, look, I can't improve on that. That's where the booklet ends, you know, with Socrates. So, you know, it began with him, it ends with him. So, all right. Well, look, thank you. That's a little overview for it. And again, I appreciate this opportunity to talk about that. So, okay.
Stephen, thank you so much for the summary of your book. We're going to turn it over now to our first critic, Anthony Booth. Please take us away.
Great. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, Stephen, for that. It was fascinating. So just crack on. So I've long been an admirer of Stephen's and Stephen's work. And reading it's always kind of felt like taking in a bit of a breath of fresh air. Because to me, so much of contemporary epistemology, I just feel is kind of so extremely deferential to the kind of contours of the tradition, the literature, to just a handful of kind of individual figures that sometimes gets to the point of kind of hero worship. And I personally find that a little bit, that kind of deferential attitude, a little bit sort of anti-philosophical, but it's not one that you could ever really find in Stephen's work. So fearless has he been in attempting to take on the whole kind of enterprise of epistemology and to kind of winch it onward, as it were. Uh, and Stephen's element here shares that kind of slightly iconoclastic ambitions, I think, of his previous works. And I thought that was especially the case in defending this thesis, and a thesis that I think is a really fascinating one, I'll say, uh, that he's just laid out, that he calls knowledge minimalism. The thesis, I know he's just laid it out, but let me just quickly recapitulate that it's, quote, that there is nothing more to knowing than the presence of a true belief, interpreted as a metaphysical thesis describing knowledge's inner nature. So literally nothing is involved in some things being knowledge per se, other than the true belief, unquote. And as Stephen just explained, that doesn't rule out, of course, there being interesting accidental features of knowing. It's just not what knowledge's essence is. A really fertile position, I think, and interesting to make this division, this new kind of question about trying to ask what knowledge's essence really is. Now, much of the case for knowledge minimalism, I think, is that's it, as it's developed in this element, has also been developed in Stephen's earlier work. I think Stephen just mentioned his 2016 book, so I think you'll find that case quite laid out in detail in that book. But it does set out in the element. It sets out to do a couple of new things. Again, I'll quote here. So, quote, it highlights modalized epistemology from within post-Gettier epistemology. So that's one thing. And it's also new, continuing with the quote, in calling upon its some ancient Greek philosophy in urging a halt to contemporary epistemology's modalized journey. I like the kind of the sort of language that's involved here, as I say, quite iconoclastic, right? Calling for a halt. So anyway, I'll focus here in my few brief comments on those two aspects of the work, and especially the latter part. So I'm just going to really ask a bunch of questions, really. I'm not, in these short comments, I don't know if they really can be called objections, but just some questions. So my first question is this, and I think Stephen kind of alluded to this right at the early part, but nevertheless I'll ask it. And it concerns what Bernard Williams kind of slightly disparagingly, I think, called the kind of piety for the history of the subject. Um, Now, Stephen's interpretation of Plato, and I would imagine Aristotle's as well, is fairly idiosyncratic in certain respects. I'm not sure it's fully the interpretation that one really finds in contemporary epistemology. Putting to one side the fascinating findings of the last pages of the Theaetetus for now. But I wonder whether Stephen has parted company from his kind of previous rebellious self, the self that didn't quite succumb to the, the allure of arguments from authority. But why? So why is it significant that Greek philosophy, interpreted in a certain way, makes the kind of very same recommendations that Stephen does, if it weren't for for the possibility of inherited authority from those giants? So I wonder what the connection is. Why focus on the history of philosophy there? Okay, so that's my first question, right? The second one concerns what Stevens called the further features question, which he's laid out nicely earlier just now. And what he calls the knowledge's further features question is roughly the question of what knowledge might be beyond simply true belief. So now let's just assume that Stephen's arguments, that again he's laid out now, go through on the point that any attempt to answer this question, the question of, what might knowledge be simply beyond true belief, in a modalized manner, must do so while kind of only traveling to worlds that contain putative items of knowledge that are true beliefs. What he called it, that we hold the true dogs in place throughout as we're traveling. I think he just used that sort of locution. Okay, now actually, I think just a quick aside, I think that's a really fascinating insight from Stephen, and that doesn't get quite, I don't think quite gets the sort of attention that it deserves. But nevertheless, so let's just assume that that's true. Okay, so let's assume that's true that it's true for answering knowledge's further features question. But suppose that logos or justification or warrant or some concept in the vicinity doesn't solely belong to the genus knowledge, right? So that there might be some interesting motivation for thinking about justification that isn't just for understanding what knowledge is. Okay, you might think evidence might be something like that. We might want to understand evidence for its own sake, not just because of to answer knowledge's further features question. So then, suppose that what epistemologists of the variety that Stephen's kind of picking out are aiming to understand while they're traveling to these worlds where the putative items of knowledge aren't true beliefs, are not further features of knowledge. So what they're doing there is to try and understand justification, broadly construed, right? So justification, logos, warrant, etc. And so that once they've got a handle of what justification is, right, they can use that to serve the question regarding knowledge. So just as perhaps we might think that hearts don't solely belong to the genus mammal, but discovering what a heart is might help us discover what a mammal is. So now, might this understanding of what epistemologists might be up to, right? That they're just looking at justification in the way that one might try to understand the heart, even though it might be a necessary feature of being a mammal, but one might want to just understand hearts independently of their mammalness connection. So might that be what Stephen calls the horizontal version of the Aristotelian kind of genus differentiae method of definition? Well, if it is, he rejoined as, quote, it can seem to reach its result that being truth tracking is essential to knowing only while setting aside truths being essential to knowledge. Okay, now again, so it seems to be the same point again, really, but maybe that's a problem for the truth tracking account, or that Nozick account where you're not with those sorts of condition, those final condition, third and fourth conditions in the truth tracking account aren't there to kind of define justification. Um, but why not just why would they be a problem for other kind of anti-luck notions of justification broadly construed? Why would it be so analogously so strange for us to think that mammals necessarily have hearts but in order to understand hearts, we must do so while setting aside essential features of being a mammal. Perhaps doing so precisely allows us to pick out a taxonomy of different types of hearts or justification, such we can then pick out the one that seems to be sufficient, that's right for mammals, or sufficient for knowledge when combined with true belief. Okay, so now, relevantly to this question, here's another question. Stephen admits that we do have, or at least most of us, or people that have been working in epistemology, that have an intuition, whatever that means, that knowledge is more than just a mere true belief. But he responds, quote, is intuition enough to deliver definitive knowledge of knowledge's inner metaphysical nature, something that's beyond true belief? And he responds later in the passage, I don't believe so. And further, I have not grounded my knowledge minimalist challenge in any counter-intuition. It is grounded in this element's argument, end quote. But hasn't the argument been that current attempts to answer the further features question in modalized epistemology is that they've done so while errantly considering or traveling metaphorically away from worlds that he kind of advised us that we needed to remain tethered to? So is that an argument that all attempts are doomed to do the same thing? Or wouldn't the putative inconceivability of an account that remained true to the desideratum that Stephen's urging upon us just be a kind of counter-intuition to the demand that the answer to the further feature questions was a genuine one? Okay, now finally, I was really blown away by Stephen's discovery of the missing pages of the Theaetetus, and as Stephen says in there, who knew in the Sydney was I need to get myself to Sydney, right? In a Sydney bookshop that you find these things. Absolutely amazing. So I'm sure, Stephen said, I was surprised just now that you're talking them as being a fiction. I'm not sure about that. Because they strike me as plausible. And to me, what's plausible about them is that Plato seems to finally, in these missing pages, connects the paradox that he talks about in Meno with the account of knowledge in the Theaetetus. And it seems at least to me, a bit strange that contemporary epistemologists have taken the essential lessons of Meno as to knowledge's value over true opinion. There's that stuff about the tethering of the statues as Daedalus, as independent from the rest of the lengthy discussion in the dialogue on that paradox. But interestingly, in Meno, Plato has Socrates call the paradox an eristic paradox. So I think that would mean then that we can infer that it belongs to the sophists, so that it's a sophistical paradox, really. And this brings to my mind the supposedly only comedic amongst Plato's inside Plato's repertoire that was written around the time of the Meno, called the Euthydemus. And aside from any controversy as to whether really it's a comedy, I'm not sure how hilarious it really is, but or there's some sort of controversy as to when exactly it was dated. I don't think there's any controversy over this one, in a way that maybe on Stevens there might perhaps be some controversy as to whether it really was Plato's. So I don't think there's any controversy whether this one was Plato's. Now, I wonder if this dialogue Euthydemus raises the question whether Stephen, qua rebel, has really been as really radical enough in his interpretation of Plato. So in Euthydemus, we find Socrates meeting two well-known sophists, Dionysodorus and the eponymous Euthydemus, who raise a structurally identical problem, I think, to the heuristic one of Meno. So they ask Cleinias, Socrates' protege, are those who learn the wise or the ignorant? And Cleinias, overpowered by the question, blushes and finally answers that those who learn are the wise. But he's then kind of forced to revise his answer since Euthydemus points out that the wise, say the grammar master or the lyre master, are the teachers, not the learners. And so quotes, the unlearned learn, not the wise. But he's then quickly led to aporia by Dionysodorus, who took up the argument like a ball which he caught. So I think it's metaphorically important that in this dialogue, the sophists are working as a kind of double act. I'm going to try and share my screen now to see if I can get you the bit of the dialogue up. All right, people can see that? Okie doke. All right. So here's Dionysodorus in Plato's mouth. So, but tell me now, is learning acquiring knowledge of that which one learns? And Cleinias assented. And knowing is having knowledge at the time. He agreed. And not knowing is not having knowledge at the time. He admitted that. And are those who acquire, those who have or have not a thing, those who have not? And have you not admitted that those who do not know are of a number of those who have? He agreed. Then Cleinias, he said, those who do not know learn, and those who, are not those who know. Now, sorry, I should have put I'll play from the current slide. Okay, I'll come back to you in my next slide. So I take the passage to nicely illustrate what the sophists' aim for Plato was always not really to educate, but to kind of overpower and to embarrass their opponents. And further, as I said, I think the puzzle presented to Cleinias here looks structurally similar, if not kind of isomorphically identical to the heuristic paradox that's sometimes called Meno's paradox. Now, I don't quite have the time here, but I think we should be able to demonstrate that there can be no transition from learner to the wise is equivalent to there can be no learning, but only recollection as per Meno. But then it appears to me not beyond the bounds of kind of reasonability that when Socrates labels Meno's question at ATD and Meno heuristic, he has in mind the same puzzles from Euthydemus above. And what's striking is that in Euthydemus, he gives a very different and much less fantastical solution than to that puzzle than that we found in the Meno. Okay, so here's the solution, really simple solution here that Socrates gives, because this is supposed to be an elaborate jest, really, and there was always a simple solution to all of this. Socrates says, the two foreign gentlemen, perceiving that you did not know, wanted to explain to you that the word to learn has two meanings. And it is used first in the sense of acquiring knowledge of some matter of which you previously had no knowledge, and also, when you have knowledge, in the sense of reviewing this matter, whether something done or spoken by the light of this newly acquired knowledge. The latter is generally called knowing rather than learning, but the word learning is also used. And you do not see, as they explain to you, that the term is employed of two opposite sorts of men, of those who know and those who do not know. And there was a similar trick in the second question, when they asked you whether men learn what they know or what they do not know. These parts of learning are not serious, and therefore I say that the gentlemen are not serious, but are only playing with you. So it seems that Plato has Socrates here identify two kinds of knowledge, uh, and tells us that the puzzle is really solved by identifying a kind of a fallacy of ambiguity and an equivocation between them. So I think the two kinds of knowledge are sort of we can identify here as like as such. The first is a kind of knowledge that is of a sort that can be newly acquired, kind of from nothing, that we may call kind of maybe knowledge from acquaintance, where we previously had no knowledge. And the second knowledge is that knowledge too there of a sort that that one can gain when this previously acquired knowledge is spoken or communicated to you by somebody else, presumably by definition or a description, which cannot be acquired kind of ex nihilo. Or of when you seek to classify the thing you have learnt into the definitions you have, as per, going to Paris for the first time, knowing Paris, and then asking, well, is Paris the same kind of city as Coventry? So from the quotation before, when you have the knowledge in the sense of reviewing the matter, I think that's what he's maybe getting at. So, or perhaps in Aristotelian terms, there seems to be a difference between knowledge you get when nous grasps a first principle, like the principle of non-contradiction or something. Nous just grasps this, he tells us at the end of the posterior analytics. Or which is supposed to be the sort of middle terms of the syllogisms, and the knowledge you get then when having already assented to such a middle term, you successfully learn something by running a syllogism. So there's a difference between what you learn from running a syllogism and then just how you know the middle term, which is just nous grasps it. You just see it, something like that. The solution to Menno's paradox, then, I think, is merely that we're equivocating on these two types of knowledge in the Euthydemus. So taking it back to the Menno, it asks of the slave boy that's in the Menno who knows geometry without knowing any of its attendants' descriptions and definitions. But how could they know? As if we were saying that the slave boy both knows and doesn't know, and hence why it seems, paradoxical. But the paradox is chimerical once he sees that he knows geometry in one sense, but not in another. And knowledge of virtue, the starting theme of the Menno, it turns out, is the sort of thing that admits of no definition. Is this sort of knowledge one? There's just that kind of nous just grasps it. And so it is with this knowledge of knowledge, it's not the sort of thing that one can teach another through description of definition. So knowledge that you learn through description is that sort of stuff that's not tethered. It's that first kind of knowledge that's the tethered one. So then I wonder whether Stephen's knowledge minimalism in attempting to get, and Stephen's Socrates, in attempting to define knowledge in some way, to describe knowledge's inner essence, are guilty of the same mistake. That knowledge is a sort of thing that can be learned. Assumed that knowledge of knowledge is the sort of thing that can be learned through definition. So that will be my final question for Stephen. But I'll just end by just saying that having said everything I've just said, I tremendously enjoyed the elements, and certainly thanks to it, I've really got a better understanding of his overall position than I had in previous moments of time. So there's certainly some pedagogical value in seeing it through the prism of Plato and Aristotle, at least for me. Now, I've been raising the question of whether, oh, pardon me, whether Stephen perhaps has been radical enough here, but there's probably something it is to be too radical too, right? As well as not being radical enough, and perhaps Stephen gets that balance much is much more on the money on that balance than these comments, these very brief comments might suggest. So thank you again. I'll stop sharing the screen if I can.
Thanks, Anthony. Stephen, if you could respond in maybe 10 minutes, that'd be
all right.
great.
Thanks. I'll give a few comments. Tony, I hope I'll get to the Euthydemus one and the stuff at the Meno and all that. That I'm kind of puzzled as to what to make of that. It's quite a big one, but let me make a few simple, what I hope are simple but useful comments. Certainly, your initial, the first in no particular order here, Greek philosophy. Am I too differential? Look, the motivation was not, it was really an ad hominem kind of one. It wasn't that I set out to, yes, I do like the Greek philosophy. I do respect it, obviously, as a lot of us do. But that wasn't the motivation. The idea, the focus on it was not because I think, oh, look what I can find from it, and look how it leads, I can make it lead to a view that I somehow independently like. It wasn't like that. It was really just the idea that in thinking about how we, as a general group, how we approach these questions, where do we begin? And I honestly was just trying to look back and work with what I took to be, well, I don't know how deep it is, but some sort of deep enough motivation for a lot of us. Maybe it's the general idea that a lot of us, we want to find some, venerable, classical, foundation, methodological foundation for what we do. Anyway, so my thinking was just, let me go back and see if we really are being fair to where we claim to be able to ground a lot of these projects. So I didn't mean in that sense to be kind of independently just deferring to Greek philosophy. It was more just, it seems to me that when epistemologists, contemporary ones, look to find, antecedents, venerable antecedents, so that we can prove to ourselves that we're not just making it all up now and just focusing on new issues, that, we do typically look back to the Meno and Theaetetus. So that honestly was my motivation there. It was just, let's go back, let me look harder at that and just see whether it is as simple as that, in the way that we tend to respond. So, yeah, as I kept reading, I found myself a bit more deferential, but that really wasn't the initial thinking. So, intuitions. It's a bit out of order here because I had some combined notes. Have I relied on a counterintuition? That the demand, saying that the demand to an answer, asking for an answer to the further features question was a genuine one. I hope not. I certainly not. I mean, on the face of it, I don't. So if I do, you're digging deep into me, because I never say it's intuitively clear that, and I'm not just trying to be sort of, cute there. It's again, the thinking was ad hominem there. It seemed to me that kind of implicit respect for the sort of the Meno kind of, the Meno example there, the interaction, which I then, sort of parsed as with the few of the features question. Doesn't matter, leaving me aside. The point was, it seemed to me that the respect for that was deep-seated enough there that I was just trying to work with that. In effect, I'm saying, like, our fellow epistemologists will say it's something like, it's intuitively clear that Socrates and Meno were onto a good question there and framing something nicely, etc., and we should respect that. So if intuition's in there, it seems to me it's not mine. to start with. Again, I'm trying to respond to that. So it's not the aim of being a rebel about it. You know, nothing wrong with that, I suppose, but it wasn't the moment, but it really was a, should I be taking, if they're really going to reach for this so implicitly and respectfully, which it seems to me happens, well, what's going on there? And that's all I was trying to do there. So I'm taking it very seriously because I think that we as a group, epistemologists, take it seriously. So I was just trying to examine what constraints, if any, we should be placing upon ourselves in taking it seriously. So that was the thinking there. Yeah, the idea of your example with hearts. Okay, I wasn't entirely sure if I was getting it. Let me ask you. So just this might or might not be kind of the case you had in mind, but let's suppose when I read your comments there, I first thought, okay, there's two situations there. One is, here are some hearts which we've already identified as mammal hearts. Now let's just think about them. The other is, here's an array of hearts, and we haven't yet identified some of them as being mammalian. And we just want to think about hearts. Now, you know, a few minutes ago, you did talk about like the genus just generically talking about hearts. And then we would go back and we can examine, of course, we can do that, of course. So let's think about hearts per se. And the analogy was, I suppose, you're thinking of something like, that'd be like thinking about justificate what we might want of, let's say, epistemic justification per se, without assuming that we're talking about, in my case here, epistemic justification paired with true belief, which automatically pulls it back and limits it and commits us to that further features thing. All right, okay. Okay, so fair enough. And so to strengthen your point too, it's kind of like, suppose we want to say, look, let's think about justification and let's build in there that's broad enough to encompass, say, a fallible justification, where we don't assume truth there, right? Because it could be that you've got the justification, but it's for a false belief. Okay, so that's correct, right? So we're thinking about justification per se, that's like sort of just an array of hearts, without presuming that some of the mammals, some of them are or that we've got mammal ones identified as mammal ones, right? So, okay, now we can do that. But I wasn't sure whether, look, and of course that can help us, but that still seemed to me like what I was describing, where we say we can independently think about, say, other epistemic features in their own right. And then we might want to say, and when you've got a case of sort of minimally described or essentially described knowledge, true belief, maybe that could be added on in a given situation. But my argument was partly just, and that's fine. And that would help us understand, therefore, that situation. And we do it partly by drawing on that independent analysis of the justification, right? So like independent analysis of hearts. So we bring that justification back, combine it with, for example, a true belief in front of us. And we might then see how this true belief gets to be justified. And that would tell us something about that situation. And we might therefore understand what's going right or wrong there. Okay, so the way my argument, I think, responds to that is that that's okay, that's fine. We all take seriously the idea of independent epistemological interest in various epistemic features. And then we can look for maybe combining that with a given true belief. But my point was just that you can't presume that you were thereby describing part of the essence of knowing. You got to the essence of knowing from the outset through the further features question by identifying the essence, and that's what keeps cropping up. And then independently, you might find some people are satisfying this account of justification, some people are satisfying another, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, that's how we describe those different epistemic contexts. But it's just the point about in those contexts, there's a mix of essence and accident there. And so it'd be like saying, because otherwise, if you've identified a heart as a mammalian and you say something like, well, if we could do that by setting aside sort of its being the essential features of being a mammal, but you haven't, because if you've identified it as a mammal heart, they come with it. So you brought that across. So that's why I said it seemed to me when I was looking at your comments, which it's a nice example to get to raise this point, which I do think is definitely a point that should be, I want to be engaging with. So that's the point about the hearts per se versus the mammal hearts. If you just raise the hearts per se, that is good, and that covers the idea of just like justification per se, which is why, like I said earlier, if we can think about these things where, for example, they're not truth linked, we can think more generally about justification, say responsibilist accounts, which, really don't depend on a particular intimate link to truth there, but they have an independent worth. Okay, so that's, so it's a nice, I think it's a nice, it's a good one for me to think about. Yeah, and that was how I was responding. It's a nice way of the analogy.
Great. Pierre, please, if you could give us your comments now, that'd be wonderful.
All right, thanks, Paul. So normally I don't like to read comments, but in the interest of time, and since we've got a limited amount of time, I think I'm gonna read my comments and I'll share them with you just so that you can follow as we're going along. So I just have to find the share on the screen. All right, so Stephen's defining knowledge is a remarkable work of epistemology, for rarely does one come across so much cogency and insight in so few words. His element exemplifies the virtues and values of this series. Stephen rightly avers, to quote him, that contemporary epistemology would profit from attending more closely to the ancient world for increased guidance on how to approach the challenge of defining knowledge. Although not ultimately convinced by his case for knowledge minimalism, that is, that true belief that P suffices for knowledge that P, I acknowledge its depth and force. Accordingly, I don't aim in these comments to raise a host of objections, but rather to pose a series of questions, Stephen's answering of which may help readers more fully understand his position and case for it. It may very well be that he has already anticipated these questions and has answers to them, but could not address them within the space constraints of this element. He may wish to address them in his response. So I've organized my comments in terms of 5 sets of such questions. So let me proceed now to the first set of questions that actually begins with the very first sentence of the element. So his very first sentence takes the form of a question, namely, what is it to know a truth or a fact? He takes this to have been posed by Socrates in at least 2 Platonic dialogues. But what exactly is being asked by way of this question? In contemporary parlance, a fact can be a truth, a true proposition, or a truth maker, that in virtue of which a proposition is true. Suppose we take it in the first sense and let P be some true proposition. For instance, that emus are native to Australia, that limes are denser than lemons, that Naxos is north of Crete, and so on. As I read him at least, Stephen throughout this element construes his opening question as being in effect tantamount to, what is it to know that P where P is true? In doing so, he takes his opening question to be concerned with knowledge that P, where knowledge, such knowledge requires belief that P and can be defined in terms thereof. And it's very natural and commonplace for us contemporary epistemologists to do so. But is that what Socrates or Plato had in mind when posing this question? Daiwai Li has written a very interesting dissertation in which he argues, amongst other things, that the epistemological preoccupation with knowledge that P as analyzable in terms of belief that P first arose in the 19th century in the work of Bolzano, Brentano, and others. If Lee is correct, and I think he makes an impressive case, is there not something anachronistic about thinking that Socrates or Plato is concerned with knowledge that P, conceived of as analyzable in terms of belief that P? Moreover, if this is what Socrates or Plato had in mind when posing the question, they were fantastically avant la lettre in being Cantabrigian rather than Oxonian. So, one thinks in terms of analyzing knowledge in terms of belief, and the other one denies that this can be done. Well, my apologies. All right, now suppose we take it in the second sense, that is, as a question about truth makers. In that case, we're talking about what makes truths truths. And here, is it not the case that Socrates or Plato has in mind that it is the forms that make truths truths? Is this not a very different question than what most epistemologists today are concerned with? All right, so that was my first set of questions. Now I'd like to pose a second set of questions. Stephen, on page 5, and I think elsewhere, equates true belief with correct opinion. But are they one and the same? 2 points deserve attention here. Not all philosophers have equated true belief and correct opinion. To take one example, Kant did not. As a case in point, consider the following passage from the Critique of Pure Reason. The holding of a thing to be true, or the subjective validity of the judgment in its relation to conviction, which is the same time objectively valid, has the following degrees: opining, believing, and knowing. Opining is such holding of a judgment as is consciously insufficient, not only objectively, but subjectively. If our holding of the judgment be only subjectively sufficient, and is at the same time taken to be objectively insufficient, we have what is termed believing. Lastly, when the holding of a thing to be true is sufficient both subjectively and objectively, it is knowledge. The subjective sufficiency is termed conviction for myself. The objective sufficiency is termed certainty for everyone. There is no call for me to spend further time on explanation of such easily understood terms. Well, they may not be so easily understood as Kant thought. But the question I want to put forward here has to do with how, as one example, Kant advances a conception of knowledge on which it is the holding of a judgment that is subjectively sufficient, namely held with conviction, and objectively sufficient, held with certainty. Belief, by contrast, is the holding of a judgment that, while subjectively sufficient, is objectively insufficient, while opining is the holding of a judgment that is both subjectively and objectively insufficient. So my point here in invoking Kant, and I'm not appealing to authority here, is just to point out that, I think there's quite a number of philosophers in the history of the field who have not equated opinion with belief. And so, I think we might want to be careful of doing so. Related to that is that Stephen acknowledges that for simplicity, he has not questioned the epistemologically standard translation of doxa as belief. To quote Stephen, even though it is possibly not an ideal translation for Socrates' thinking. And he points out that Moss reinforces that point about doxa and extends it, mutatis mutandis, to the word episteme and its epistemologically standard translation as knowledge. But shouldn't Stephen question this translation? As Jessica Moss notes, when Plato sets about distinguishing cognitive states, he does so primarily by reference not to their psychological history, but instead to their objects. In the Republic and Timaeus, doxa as a whole is distinguished from knowledge by being set over the visible world rather than the intelligible. In the Republic, the two species of what is there called doxa, pistis and dicasia, are distinguished by their respective objects, ordinary visible things and their images. In the Theaetetus, doxa is distinguished from the inferior cognitive state of perception aesthetis by having access to a different class of objects, commons, prominent among them being ousia. And to continue from what Moss was arguing, Plato, like his Hellenistic successors, draws a distinction between passively yielding to an appearance and actively affirming a claim about how things are. Only in the latter case does one count as having one's mind directed at what is as opposed to what merely appears. Thus, the higher mental states, pistis in the Republic, doxa in the Theaetetus, have access to higher objects because they result from active questioning and affirmation. The Republic's distinction between visible objects themselves and their appearances, and the Theaetetus's distinction between proper perceptibles and the objects of doxa, anticipate the skeptic's distinction between what appears and what underlies the appearances, where we have cognitions about the latter only when we engage in active assent. And so I know that Stephen is quoting from Moss here, but I think she makes some interesting points that are relevant to what he was saying. And notice above, in what I just made reference to, how Moth references the Republic, Timaeus, and Theaetetus. Although Stephen rightly attends to the Meno and the Theaetetus in this element, as I read it, I wonder why he attended so little to the Republic and its rich discussion of episteme as contrasted with and distinguished from doxa. If contemporary epistemology would profit from attending more closely to the ancient world for increased guidance on how to approach the challenge of defining knowledge, shouldn't we also attend more closely to the Republic? Okay, so now for my fourth set of questions, and here I'd like to quote a passage from the element at some length, if they'll permit, because I think it's a very fascinating passage. When knowledge minimalism says there is nothing more to knowing than the presence of a true belief, I hear this as a metaphysical thesis describing knowledge's inner nature. Literally nothing is involved in something's being knowledge per se, other than its being a true belief. But I do not infer from this that, as it happens, no instances of knowledge have, in at least the sense of being conjoined with instantiations of, features beyond being true and being belief. Maybe some do, maybe all do. My metaphysical reading of knowledge minimalism is compatible with an empirical non-minimalism about knowledge's outer nature, where this might reflect empirical facts about how knowing is actually manifested in our world. This is why I said, as it happens a moment ago, the metaphysical reading is compatible with many, even all, actual instances of knowledge also having been, even if not in a deeply constitutive way, epistemically valuable, perhaps readily observable. Further features, such as being accompanied by good evidence, features to which epistemologists rightly devote much attention. And Stephen was talking about this in his introduction earlier. My point is that these further features would never be part of knowing's essence as knowing, being knowledge at all. They would be like a person's clothes, yet without making the person, they might cover the knowledge, even making it publicly respectable, yet without being literally a constitutive part of it. So as I was saying, this is a fascinating point. But consider the analogy. If nothing but true belief is the inner nature of knowledge, why is it so widely held in contemporary epistemology that knowledge minimalism is false? This is so, or at least it seems to me, because it strikes so many of us as preposterous to hold that any and every true belief whatsoever, no matter how unjustified or irrational or unreliably formed, counts as an instance of knowledge. If knowledge minimalism is indeed correct, as Stephen contends, why do its implications seem so preposterous to so many of us? Is it simply a matter of our confusing and accidental with an essential feature of knowledge? To use Stephen's analogy, few of us confuse a person with their clothes, So why would so many of us confuse a non-constitutive part of knowledge with knowledge itself? Why, moreover, is it so widely held that there is an extra value problem? Namely, the problem of what makes knowledge more valuable than true belief. All right, now, to be sure, and as Stephen indicated earlier, he doesn't believe that we should miss knowledge minimalism because we know by intuition that it's false. And as he notes, to quote him from page 51, being assured of knowledge minimalism's counterintuitive nature is epistemically inconclusive at best. Dismissing a view because it is counterintuitive, as can occur, would seem to reflect a confidence that philosophy is easier than most of us usually say it is. All right, fair enough. But doesn't Stephen himself rely on intuitions in making his case for knowledge minimalism? Now, earlier we heard that Stephen says he's not, but I'd like maybe for Stephen to expand on that point a bit. All right, my fifth set of questions. If knowledge is nothing more than true belief, then what is ignorance? On the standard view of ignorance, which I, for instance, have defended, to be ignorant that P is to lack knowledge that P. Now, if knowledge that P is nothing but true belief that P, and I think Stephen said, well, the essence of it is nothing but true belief that P, then ignorance that P is nothing but lack of true belief that P, or at least the essence of it. This means that any true belief, no matter how irrational or unjustified or unreliably formed, counts as non-ignorance. Now take the example in the Theaetetus of the jury members who form a true belief by being swayed by lawyerly oratory and not based on the facts of the case. Are these jury members not ignorant despite their true belief? Is Stephen willing to accept the consequence that any true belief, no matter how irrational or unjustified or unreliably formed, counts as non-ignorance? Does he perhaps have an alternative account of ignorance? If so, what is it? So I hope that Stephen finds these questions helpful, given as they are in the spirit of constructive criticism. And of course, they no way detract from the ample virtues and value of Stephen's Elements, which deserves to be widely read, and I hope will be widely. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks a lot, Pierre. Aaron, for the sake of time, can I ask if we go over a little bit, just given where we're at, is that a problem for you or okay?
That's fine.
Because we could push you into the queue and rearrange things, but okay, then great. Stephen, if you could keep your comments to 10 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to be succinct. So, Pierre, great, thank you. So let me engage quickly. So first, the Republic. I mean, a few of your questions, like with Jessica Moss and so on, they come around the Republic and some of the issues that come off there. Kant as well. Okay, so I can be quick about that. I agree completely that the Republic is also of epistemological significance and of interest for contemporary epistemologists. I didn't do it in this element. I do actually right now have a long manuscript in which one of the chapters, which is some of the same spirit as this, and one of the chapters is precisely on the Republic, and I have a lot more discussion of it there. Here's the quick response. Here's why I think it links directly. Another argument, another line of my kind of thought about knowledge, which hasn't come up here, is what I call knowledge practicalism. And on that view, all knowledge that, and yeah, bracket for the moment, actually genuinely helpful comments there about knowledge that, etc., and the history there with facts, truth makers, etc. I'm actually really sympathetic to that. By the way, the quick comment there is, yeah, once again, I know it might not sound satisfying, but once again, I was trying to sort of minimally work with what I see in front of me from, in contemporary epistemology. So trying to just not sort of, I tried to keep it as much in other people's terms as I could for contemporary epistemologists there. So I completely agree with you there about the inherent interest there with and Kant and Brentano, etc. Excellent. But the point, so I can quickly say there for knowledge practicalism, on that account, I genuinely do think independently, I do like to bring in the Republic, because I've argued independently that all knowing that, regardless of what the object of the that is actually a kind of knowledge how. And so in the Republic, okay, two main things in the Republic, and one of them bears, of course, upon, they're both implicit in some of your comments, the book 5 with the knowledge versus true belief. There's having different kinds of objects there, which is obviously what Jessica Moss is getting at as well. But the other thing, and so that's correct, but it's the main thing I wanted to link with right now was that in book 7, where you get the powers argument, and of course on the powers argument, again, knowledge as a kind of power is exactly the kind of thing I've argued for separately, that all knowing is knowing how, with, throw details in. But so that's why but that's a whole separate kind of debate, a whole separate kind of tradition there that to get into parallel to this one. So that's the argument. So yeah, I completely agree with you that that stuff is all genuinely just as significant. It's just I was trying to think, well, let me try to make this case responding to this big part of what's around us, in contemporary epistemology, and also, by the way, what I take to be the more prominent part. So, when I'm arguing separately that for knowledge practicalism, as I call it, I mean, it's kind of a minority view. I hate to, take Tony's prominence, call it a rebel view, but it's not meant to be in that spirit, but probably functionally works that way too. So anyway, that's the comment. That's the stuff on that. So I can be quick there. That yes, excellent. I agree. All right, I'm with you there. Clothing and essences and so on. So let me quickly comment on that. And along the way, while I say it, as I find my comments on that, again, about intuitions, you're right, I'm going to say something similar to what I said to Tony, which is, look, if you can convict me in there of, covertly using intuitions, then I'll plead, guilty. I honestly don't think I am. I honestly think that I'm working with, as I said to Tony, others' intuitions and trying to say, well, if you're committed to that, you think intuition gives you this view, let me at least try to see what I can do with that view. And and then as I argue, it sort of turns into this alternate conception or approach. But it wasn't that I independently have an intuition about this approach and throw it there. Anyway, that's how I see what I'm doing. So, but if you find the intuition, email me. So, so accidental. Well, look, fair enough. Well, I do think when I said about the metaphysical, the inner kind of nature versus the empirical outer nature there. Well, it sounds like you find it more surprising than I do that we could mistake those two in a given context. We could mistake one for the other. We could mistake an accidental feature for an essential one. But, well, okay, obviously I'm giving an argument for there being this distinction here, but independently, I suppose it's not clear to me that we couldn't mistake them. That's why that sort of debate has historically been so tricky. But I did have a more direct comment there about clothes. Yes, when we say clothes maketh the person, I said we don't mean that clothes are helping to make the person be literally a person, sure. But we can mean that the person in a social or public role could be inseparable from or even defined by what they're wearing. We philosophers, of course, tend to think that it's totally irrelevant, but socially that's possibly not wholly representative of what's around us, and people do identify more closely. So that's part of the idea was that what I was thinking there was that we can bring in the idea of sort of these other epistemic features potentially as terms of public roles that the essence of knowing gets called upon to play, and that maybe that's where we want to talk particularly about justification. Obviously, Edward Craig, with his influential 1990 book about markers of reliability and so on. This stuff is all potentially of social relevance. And that's more like the analogy of the clothes there, I think, somewhat superficially, but yeah. But even privately, you know, I think of in terms of, say, you know, if private language issues aside, think internally, you know, there's you versus your sort of public role versus, you know what I mean? Within yourself, there's the most private, and then there's a kind of stepping back and reflecting on and talking with yourself, etc., about it. So if you're trying to think about what you take to be a true doxa there, the true belief, then what can you say about that as support? That'd be like bringing the clothes, putting these clothes on, those clothes on, etc. So it's not even just literally public, but okay. Ignorance. Yeah, no, I'm aware this is obviously one of your, you know, you're far less ignorant than I am on the nuances of this one. So, but here's a quick response. I see above about knowledge gradualism. So if there can be better and worse ways or grades of knowing that P, presumably they can, and given what you say, perfectly reasonably, potentially there can be better and worse grades of ignorance there. So you can be an ignorance gradualist as well. And so the idea would be that, yeah, the jury members, you know, they meet the first condition there. But of course we can then make it more complicated and more interesting ways to be ignorant. So more subtle ways. So it's not just an all you can, just a blanket. If you do fail even the true belief, then you don't even make that level of non-ignorance. If you do make the true belief and nothing else, then you've passed potentially only that initial step. And it's like, I don't know whether you like the idea or not, but it'd be like sort of saying that the essence of ignorance, like the minimal essence, would just be not even having the true belief. And then we can go on beyond that. Paul, was that quick enough?
It is. Thank you. Baron, you're up.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. It's a great pleasure to be asked to participate in this Philosopher Meets Critics session for Stephen Hetherington. I've long been an admirer of his work, which has always been characterized by a bold willingness to rethink accepted wisdom and a genuine depth of insight regarding what epistemology has been, is, and could be. In this work, Stephen offers us a reconsideration of the standard approach to analyzing knowledge, returning to some of the earliest arguments in what we now think of as epistemology, found in Plato's dialogues. He devises a methodology for inquiring into the nature of knowledge. Where Socrates asked in the Meno about the difference between true belief and knowledge, Stephen turns this into the knowing's further features question, which he characterizes as such. What more is needed if a true belief is to be knowledge? In what ways can a true belief fall short of being knowledge? Asking the question in this way turns out to constrain the sort of answers one might give. The surprising result then is knowledge minimalism. Knowledge just is true belief. Knowledge has no further features once we grant that it's true belief. And I think Stephen at one point suggests that these purported further conditions would add nothing of explanatory worth to an account of the nature of knowledge. Stephen's book ends with a continuation of Plato's Theaetetus, in which Socrates comes to rethink his preliminary sense that knowledge must be more than true belief. Whether Socrates actually would have done so is a fascinating question, but one too rarefied for me. So instead, I will follow an appropriately humbler model in objecting to Stephen's view, Gonerloh's In Defense of the Fool. So just as Gonerloh rejected Anselm's proof of God's existence by showing that Anselm's argumentative structure could be used to derive absurd conclusions, like the existence of the perfect island, I will argue that Stephen's methodology also goes awry in ways that should make us leery of using it. To see this, consider the following scenario. Bertie is a bridge architect. Building sturdy bridges is Bertie's business. Brooklyn needs a new bridge, so Bertie's Sturdy Bridges puts in a bid. The bidding process requires pointing to a past bridge as an example of one's work, so Bertie shows them the bridge he built in the Bronx. When the bridge committee sees his Bronx bridge, they're shocked that he thinks it's sturdy. It's made of cardboard, they say. How can it be sturdy? Bertie replies that this is an excellent question. To answer it, we need to know the nature of bridge sturdiness. everyone would agree with at least the following. Bridge sturdiness requires, first, that there be a structure spanning an open space, and second, that the structure still be standing. With this in mind, we now can ask what the further features of bridge sturdiness might be, in addition to there being a standing structure. So, various requirements are proposed. For example, one might want the bridge to withstand a wide range of weather conditions and use patterns. Bertie points out that it's not raining or freezing in the Bronx right now, so those conditions are irrelevant to assessing whether his Bronx bridge is sturdy. The Bridge Committee replies that they must look not only to what is happening now, but to what might happen. Ah, says Bertie, you're looking at possibilities. But which ones are relevant to evaluating the sturdiness of this specific bridge in the Bronx? The committee says that they would like to know the range of conditions in which the bridge might fail. For example, would rain weaken the cardboard so much that it would collapse? Bertie answers, I can see that water has been known to have that effect on cardboard, but I really cannot permit us to consider those possibilities in which rain, or anything else, has caused the Bronx Bridge to collapse. Our task here is to assess it for sturdiness. And we want to know if its sturdiness is anything more than its being a standing structure. And we simply cannot do that by looking at possibilities in which the bridge isn't standing. So the set of possibilities relevant to assessing the sturdiness of this bridge must include only those in which it is standing. And as it is standing in all those possibilities, it's clear that the bridge is perfectly sturdy. The chair of the Bridge Committee reflects for a moment and then says, this reasoning is perfectly general. It should apply not only to the Bronx Bridge, but to any bridge that's presently standing. Is that right? And Bertie says, indeed so. Bridge sturdiness has no further features beyond the existence of a standing structure. The Bridge Committee now faces a choice. Do they accept the bid of Bertie's sturdy bridges? Or do they move on to another bridge builder? Notice that every other bridge builder will have the same case to be made for the sturdiness of their bridges. Even if most of the bridges they've built have fallen down, that's irrelevant to the sturdiness of their bridges that remain standing. Reflecting further, the chair of the Bridge Committee says, I'm not sure which builder to choose, but I do feel confident that I no longer care about bridge sturdiness understood in the way you're suggesting, Bertie. What matters to me is that there be a standing structure that has the strength to withstand the challenges life is likely to present. And I don't see how we can evaluate that strength without paying attention to the conditions in which various kinds of bridges would fail. Call it what you will, but that's what interests me. Now, Bertie will no doubt protest that the Bridge Committee is failing to respect the nature of bridge sturdiness. But here I think the committee chair has it right. There are many different natures of things, of properties, of relations, and so forth, and not all of them matter to us. There's nothing to prevent us from focusing on just those natures that do matter to us. The Bridge Committee's primary interests are creating a structure that is practically useful and safe. If bridge sturdiness has a nature that renders it unsuitable for evaluating bridge designs with this end in mind, then so much the worse for bridge sturdiness. In a similar way, I would suggest that we are not interested in knowledge for its own sake. I care about it because I want to know how I'm cognitively related to the world around me. The possibilities that matter to me are the ones in which I have to decide what to believe, and I care about my potential failures, not those of a true belief. But this is not an idiosyncratic desire on my part. Recall Socrates' motivation for asking about knowledge in the first place in the Meno. He wanted to know how we could identify good men, those who give us correct guidance in affairs. Where the Bridge Committee wants to know whether bridge Bertie builds is likely to collapse, we want to know whether the people we hope to follow are likely to lead us astray. Finding out that a specific true belief one of them has is such that it is true in all the nearby possible situations in which it exists as a true belief is not really going to be helpful at all. Nor does it help to be told that knowledge, understood as true belief, might have accidental features that are useful in their own right. Consider two instances of knowledge, understood in the minimalist sense. K1 is simply a true belief, nothing more. K2 is a true belief well supported by evidence. When these are offered to us as the testimony of other people, it's K2, I suggest, that will get our assent. When we're trying to evaluate the strength of a bit of reasoning involving both of them, it's K1 that we will reject under pressure, since it has nothing further to recommend it. Now, it's true that we could think of K1 as knowledge, and K2 as something like knowledge plus. But the ways in which K2 are so much more useful than K1 will certainly draw our attention to it. Given that we already have a concept of true belief, it seems likely to me that we'll drop the plus from how we think of K2 and just call it knowledge, plain and simple. This may seem like a dismayingly loose way of engaging in philosophy, centering our conceptual needs rather than metaphysics. After all, I haven't even tried to take on the burden of providing a definition that meets Aristotle's requirements, as Stephen suggests we do, where we start with a genus and then add 2 differentiae in sequence. In my defense, however, this is really difficult. And even Stephen's knowledge minimalism doesn't successfully offer a definition in this sense. His view includes only 1 differentia, not 2. And in any case, reality has proved to be recalcitrant in the face of the Aristotelian desire for definitions. Let reality look to itself, I say. We have enough difficulty in making our own thinking clear and suitable for purpose. Finally, it remains to address an argument offered by Socrates in the extended Theaetetus near the end of Stephen's book. Socrates, the character there, worries that a serious problem will arise if we say that we need to know some logos is a distinguishing mark of knowledge in order to know what knowledge is. The problem is that this would lead us into a regress or a circle, since, as Stephen says, this is to describe some knowledge of what knowledge is, partly in terms of some other knowledge, namely knowledge of the logos. And I address the matter here because if this really is a problem, it would show that our thinking is not clear after all. So it's not merely a metaphysical problem, but a conceptual one. It looks as though the argument offered here is reminiscent of the 5 modes of Agrippa, in which A, a claim is made, B, challenged, and C, answered in a way that, under further questioning, never ends, either because the answers go in a circle or in an infinite regress. The Pyrrhonian argument works because the original claim cannot count as knowledge unless the questioning finally does come to some resolution, which unfortunately it does not if the Pyrrhonians are correct. This pattern holds because the original claim depends on the answers that follow. They're what would turn it into knowledge if they were capable of doing so. In the case of Socrates' argument, however, this pattern does not hold. In order to know that some logos is the distinguishing mark of knowledge, we do need to have knowledge, but we don't need to know what knowledge is. We can have knowledge without knowing what knowledge is, just as we can have a true belief without knowing what true belief is. Similarly, we can have knowledge of the logos without already having knowledge of what knowledge is. Merely describing some knowledge in terms of other knowledge is not a problem. In fact, it's a common occurrence. Much of our knowledge is derived from other knowledge. It's a problem only if we're also committed to the first bit of knowledge being fundamental. But there's no reason to think that knowing knowledge's nature is fundamental. Given the many winding paths that epistemology has taken, it's hard to see how it could be. If I could just add one last question in light of some of the responses that Stephen has made, I'm curious about how the knowledge minimalism outlined here would fit with a couple of other approaches he's taken in recent years. Gradualism on the one hand and practicalism on the other. Gradualism allows for a range of degrees of knowledge, but if minimalism is saying that knowledge is just true belief, that's not something that allows for gradualism. It's either true or it's false. It's not more true or less true. And similarly with practicalism.
Sorry, Baron, you're cutting out there for me. Can you just repeat that, please?
Oh, yes, sorry. Knowledge minimalism is saying that knowledge is just true belief, but truth doesn't really come in this gradualist way. So it would be hard to explain how you could have better or worse knowledge if it's merely just true belief. The only way I suspect would be by adding the non-essential features back into it, but it's not clear why that would make it a better or worse case of knowledge, because it's essentially no different. There's a somewhat similar question about the practicalism, because if knowledge that is ultimately a form of knowledge how is not itself really characterized in terms of truth value. And so it's the fit between these two is one that I'm not quite seeing yet. Thank you.
Oops. Okay, great. Yeah. Oh, Paul, I'm on now. Okay. Thanks, Baron. Look, since you did cut out part of that, I'll when I get to it. Okay. That last comments, because yeah, absolutely, I am aware of this, the fit kind of issue, and there's a couple of things there. So look back on the Bertie, and look, hey, I'm not commenting. He's an American bridge builder. I'm sure he's the best in the world, but you're a patriotic American there telling us about Bertie. So anyway, let me comment on that. It is tricky, but well, I'll say what I've written here, and then I did write, is it a worrying sign that I like Anselm's ontological argument? I am aware of, the criticism, but I've always liked the argument. So let's see. Now, you say, in effect, you propose we begin the attempt to understand the nature of bridges, but you say that a bridge is at least my phrase is standing, spanning structure. Okay, those two conditions. So I take it that's analogous to the Meno's saying knowledge is at least a true doxa, those two conditions. All right, so the worry is that you say then, well, you could satisfy that condition, that complex condition, with something made of cardboard. And of course, that's not sturdy. Now, let me jump in, by the way, and say, I can easily allow it not to be sturdy. And you talk about possibilities in which the thing doesn't exist. That's fine. But all we have to do is, for example, at a given moment, suppose we said, is this bridge, cardboard though it is, sturdy at this moment? Well, it's a very, very restricted kind of question, right? And we think it's not a very helpful question, but that's because we think at this moment is not the relevant kind of thing to throw in there. We assess sturdiness over time. So I don't think there's any problem for my thinking here in terms of running it over time. I'm happy to say something like, would it be essential? So technically, it's essential to this object right now at this moment that it be sturdy. Well, yes, but it's also an incredibly limited object. It's this cardboard bridge at this moment. So set that aside. I mean, I'm trying to apply my sort of stuff, right? So that's how my argument would go there, as you rightly say. But equally, who's interested in the cardboard bridge defined at this moment? What we're interested in assessing these things is the bridge over its life. So now assess this bridge considered over this time, some time span, some realistic time span. Now, built into your example, of course, is the assumption that over that time, New York has been known to get rain, and that bridge will probably not hold up so well. So collapses. Done. So there's no problem in this. You just say this, now we say, let's focus on this bridge over this period of time and run that across different possible worlds. And yes, obviously we get collapsing. So it's not sturdy. And that's easy to see. So hold it to this very moment. Right now, that thing is sturdy in a kind of technical modal sense. But it's also of no interest to the evaluation of building ongoing bridges. So consider it now as a temporally extended thing. Presumably it doesn't get extended for too long. In practice, it collapses. So therefore, no problem. So I don't think that there's a problem there. It actually reminds me, I don't know if this is helpful. It's a bit, I wrote, when reading it, I thought it's akin to Russell's stopped clock. Is one only luckily correct when forming a true belief in response to a stopped clock? No. When forming a true belief in response to a stopped clock, you're not luckily correct. You are luckily correct only when you're forming a belief in response to a stopped clock. And we tend to run these things together. But if you're going to literally say forming a true belief, and is that true belief just luckily there? Is it just luckily true? Well, again, that's like focusing on the bridge at this moment. It is standing. The belief is true. Hold that constant. Run all the modal variations. It's there. It's true. It's true, 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 true. Done. So it's no luck involved. We think as luck because that's not how we hear the example. We describe it, oh, you formed a true belief, but then we say, why is there luck? Well, sure. Shrink what's your description, make it more generic. Our belief formed in response to the stop clock. Is it going to be if it's going to be luckily true when true? Sure. Identify the belief, our belief per se across the worlds. truth is not always going to be there. It usually won't. But that's a different case. So again, it's like when I say the point back to the further features question, you identify the true belief in the first place, or the true doxa, hold that constant. That's like saying, you know, evaluating the true belief in response to the stock plot. That's different to just responding to evaluating a belief, even the belief of the same content in response. And we implicitly, I think, we run our modal stuff about luck, we run that on belief, not on true belief. We then think we can plug it back in, say, oh, see, the belief is formed luckily, therefore the true belief is present only luckily. But that's one of the implications of my critical stuff in the element, that inference isn't so good. So the idea here is, I say, that there's not a problem in imagining how the particular bridge as a temporally extended thing is sturdy. And by the way, the other thing is, of course, remember, this connects back with the point that this is about essence. So the question is that belief, is that bridge essentially sturdy? Well, only if you made it such a limited thing, as I said, that this very moment when it's actually standing. Yeah, that's essentially sturdy, but it's not a conception of sturdy that we're interested in, as you rightly say. We want the term to be being applied to a different kind of thing, a more temporally extended thing. So yeah. So that's I'm with you there. The thing about I hope I didn't miss part of the point, but the point about at the end about the Theaetetus, 2 points. One, the stuff about Agrippa, sure, except that all I was doing there was applying Socrates' own thinking. So the second part of his argument is concern about understanding logos in terms of distinguishing mark. The second half of his argument there is precisely because he says, well, suppose that we were to know what the distinguishing mark was. Then, but of course, that's not going to give us an account of knowledge per se that we are trying to understand. So it's not me there bringing it in. Again, I'm just adapting his thinking. He's the one who says whether or not we think it's good. Remember, I didn't actually end the element by saying, here we are, Socrates says it, therefore this is the truth. It was just, shouldn't he be extending his own thinking this little bit further? And given the second half of his argument against using distinguishing mark as a way of understanding logos, as a way of distinguishing true belief, true doxa from knowledge, given he thinks the second half of that argument is, imagine it was that we knew the distinguishing mark. Well, that doesn't help us because we were trying to understand knowledge per se. So whether or not we hear it as a good argument, it was his. And so that's why I was using it in that part of the argument. The trick I'll just say in that last part, because I did say I'd gesture it quickly, it's also relevant to Tony's point about the euthydemus. I'll just give this quick description. I did say in that last part of the element, I tried to imagine how Socrates himself might have been portrayed as tarrying while he was adapting his own, as I said, his concern about logos being understood as distinguishing mark. And I tried to turn that into the higher level, but his same form of reasoning, but took it up a level, where it's a concern about distinguishing mark being understood as logos. And the idea being that since he's only talking about logos, is his only sort of generic way of saying true doxa. So true doxa is different from knowledge. If you can't understand that logos in terms of distinguishing mark, then that can turn into can't understand distinguishing mark in terms of logos. And if you can't understand distinguishing mark at all, then you're back potentially to there not necessarily needing to be one. And so we're back potentially to the minimalist idea that there isn't the difference between knowledge and true doxa. Anyway, I do find it a tricky argument, but that's how I was trying to do it. And it only goes through relative to the universal generalization implicit in his own argument. That if he's talking about any knowledge, then you can run the argument on the higher level knowledge about the knowledge, which is again back to Tony's question too. So I am just applying him in the spirit of he's talking about knowledge at all. So there we run it. If he was restricting it, maybe not. Finally, your question about fitting all this in. Yeah, look, as you would know, that's a big question. You threw it at me right there at the there. So let me see what I can do. A couple of things. So gradualism. Yeah, it is a tricky thing. I'm not 100% sure in my mind about how I should ultimately make it all fit. So the way I'm doing it, because if you said something like, say it's Crispin Sartnell, for example, just says knowledge is true belief, and that's it. So for him, like evidence and all that is more like a causal thing. It's a way of getting at the true belief, but it doesn't add anything epistemically to the value of what you've got. I'm happy to see evidence and justification functioning that way, but whether it adds something to the worth, that's why I brought in by talking about essence and accident. So the idea is that in a context, and after all, remember how keen a lot of our some of us are on thinking about context. Then the idea is that, and we talk about sort of different standards across different contexts. Well, that's fine. And all I'm saying is that that can reflect contingent factors that arise in different contexts. And the gradualism there, as you said, look, but if the knowledge itself strictly is just the true belief, how does gradualism apply there? Well, the gradualism will apply to the complex of the essence and the accident, so that it applies in effect, in that sense, to the epistemic whole, part of which is the essence of the knowing. So that's that. In terms of the knowledge practicalism, yeah, that one's trickier. So, for example, just to make it even trickier for me, I have also argued that in knowledge practicalism, even belief isn't essential. Believing is like one of the I talk the epistemic diaspora, and there's just a whole bunch of ways in which you could be manifesting. There could be sub powers, like with Pierre's, mentioning the Republic, could be sub powers playing a role in a particular instance, a particular power that amounts on an occasion to knowing that, P. So you know that P on this occasion, and I might know it. Well, I might know it in virtue of these particular sub powers. Someone else might know it with different sub powers. So then we can, for example, by the way, gradualism comes in easily there because powers can be weaker or stronger, and someone could have more or fewer of them. But I'm happy to allow, for example, believing to be one of those ways of manifesting or expressing the knowing, so that it might be that on a given occasion, you don't believe. You have knowledge by various capacities that, say, reflect on, you said the truth doesn't have to be there, but somehow or other it will come in. So your actions bear upon the world, again, with Pierre's point, they can bear upon maybe various facts or states of affairs, even objects and individuals and their properties. So your various powers can reflect, different ways of abilities to interact with these aspects of reality. That can all be part of knowing a particular P. And yeah, I'm not actually ultimately, I'm not wedded to the idea of belief having to be part of that. So connecting it back with this, because I know I've gone past the 10 minutes there. Again, think of this whole thing, this element of mine as a kind of, it's an ad hominem. I'm trying to take what I see around me and trying to say, work with various assumptions that seem to me pretty embedded in our, large peer group, and that we try to inculcate in students often about forms that knowing might take. And I'm just questioning some of those. But it's not the case, therefore, I've developed a full alternative theory here. And what you're saying is you're trying to push me on how it fits with some of my other stuff. And quite right. So I'm just waving my hands, literally. But not entirely. I mean, I am aware of it. You're absolutely right to push me, and I'm aware of that, yeah. But I thought the first thing is just try to see if I can undermine some of the complacency, as it seems to me. Well, that sounds rude. I don't mean it like that. I just mean we all take things for granted, and all of us, we work with various assumptions, I and each of us. And it just seemed to me I was trying to step back and say, here's some assumptions about belief and other conditions and so on, and saying, how do they really fit together? And also with the original motivation from the Meno and all that. So I really was just trying to step back and say, how well does it work for all of us insofar as we like that ancient Greek, potentially that ancient Greek sort of origin for some of our stuff. Anyway, so that's how I've gone on a bit longer, Paul, sorry.
No need to apologize at all. Stephen, thank you so much for sharing your book with us, and thank you to the commentators so much for spending the time to think through it and give Stephen some good feedback.